It's lovely to be here in this very relaxing room. I think it's fair to say. I was here for TalosCon yesterday, and at about this time of day, I felt the overwhelming urge to fall asleep. Last talk of the day. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Miell. I'm a partner at a consultancy called Container Solutions, and we help customers build platforms. We help customers change from traditional ways of working with software to more modern ways of working. But I'm not going to talk about this today. I'm going to talk about something else. But before I do that, who do we have in the room? Put your hand up if you are call yourself a platform engineer. Oh, okay. 1, 2, 6. Okay. A developer? About the same. Okay. How about any ex-sysadmins here? More ex-sysadmins than anything else. So what do you guys do by shouting? SRE, okay. And, okay, so if you're an SRE, put your hand up if you're an SRE, not a platform engineer. Okay. If you are, keep your hand up if you're from a dev background, sysadmin background, other background, networks, what's the other? General ops, okay, all right. So we're getting more and more fragmented, aren't we, as we get older. Okay, who here is on call? Quite a lot. Sorry, not right now, just generally are there times when you're on call? Okay, so it's quite a few. If you're on call, this is more of my interest really. If you're on call, do you get paid extra to be on call, or is it just part of your job? Oh dear, you guys want to talk then? Sure. So I'll be talking about being on call quite a lot today, and I'll be talking about getting paid for it as well, strangely enough. Okay, so it's quite a mixed room then. So today I'm not talking about my current job, I'm not talking about my current company. I'm talking about, this is basically just a war story, just like what I did in a company where I was stuck in a company with a very traditional mindset, very successful company, but one that deal with technical debt at all. And I ended up having to manage a team who were trying to control it. You can look at it as a real-world Phoenix project. How many people here have read the Phoenix project? From beginning to end? Okay. I couldn't get through it. And someone said earlier it's a Marmite book. And the reason I couldn't get through it is because I didn't think it was that good a novel, sadly. But there is another book which I'll be recommending later, which the Phoenix book was based on, which I think everyone should read. Hopefully that will be useful. Even if you enjoyed the Phoenix project, you might want to read that other book. Okay, start with the backstory. We're in a cinema. What's the backstory? So I worked for a company founded in 1996. Is anyone here born after 1996? Oh, no. That's very depressing. I joined this company in 2001. I was employee 39. Anyone here born after 2001? Oh dear. Okay, so I was coding before you were born, mate. Okay, and I left that company in 2015. That company is now worth over $1 billion. I did not get equity. If I did, I probably wouldn't be here. And today I'm going to talk about the period 2006 to 2000. So probably before SRE was called a thing. So that's the baby you saw earlier was 2000. This is a little bit later. 2001, what did the company do? The company was in online gambling, and we sold back-end systems for sports betting companies. So if you've ever placed a bet in the UK online, it's probably gone through code that I've touched, for good or bad. In 2001, when I joined, the company had 4 or 5 big-ish customers, and it was what I call DevOps by default. So there's a lot of discussion today assumes what DevOps is. To me, it's changed a lot since the term was coined. So for me, DevOps was always you build it, you run it, and everything else is incidental. Whether you is you a person or you is you a team, the same group that's responsible for building it is also responsible for running it. And we were DevOps by default. What that means is really there was typically one person on a project team. That person was responsible for all the software, and it was a B2B company. So we were selling the software to another company who installed it on their systems. They did the monitoring around it. They mixed it in with their other systems on-prem and phoned us up if there was a problem. If the site was down, they would just try and get in touch with the developer. There was no concept of support or anything like that. So those engineers would get called sometimes in the pub by the person they knew on the customer, and they'd go back to the office and fix it if there was a problem. It was pretty casual. It was very early days of e-commerce, really. Then our customers started saying, well, we want to give you a support contract. And we were like, okay, you want to give us money for something? Fine. But our engineers didn't want to do support because they didn't want to be on call 24/7, 365. So we built a centralized support team. I went to market, asked people, do you want to run a support team? Have you done that before? We did that, but the customers didn't like it. The demands of sports betting are pretty focused on uptime, focused on making money. And they were used to being able to phone up a tech lead if something went wrong, or a developer if something went wrong, and they couldn't do that anymore, and they did not like it. They just would end up routing around the support process and calling those engineers. So we disbanded that team, and we said we're going to have tech leads and seniors only are going to go into this centralized support group and support for all those customers. And they did that by paying us more money, basically. So you got paid more to support the system than writing the system, which was pretty unusual then. The growth of the company continued. We got more customers. It got bigger and bigger. And in 2006, I moved from being a tech lead, one of these customers, to joining the support team. So at the time, we had 7 million of revenue. We had a team of 7, and that was it. We had 6 big customers and about 4 small ones. And we used a tool called RT, and Jira was being considered for use at the time. It was the dark ages, basically. And then from 2006 to 2014, we learned a lot. So we started, as I say, with seven people. We had tickets so customer would phone up, say the site's down or something. We'd say, okay, open. A ticket would say open. Then someone would say fixed, and then it was closed. And that was often the case. We didn't bother writing things down. It was just deal with the flood of issues coming in. So over 2007 to 2000, we introduced a bunch of changes. The biggest of which was probably ITIL. Does ITIL mean anything to anyone in here? Oh, quite a few. Okay. So it hasn't died then. When we were 7 people, we all just did the work that was coming in. We all just took the tickets and then phoned the customer and tried to sort it out. We actually restructured in that time. So I heavily argued that we should have people looking at problems as opposed to incidents. So obviously we couldn't get rid of looking at incidents because that's what we were paid to do. But we had incidents that were recurring, and we had no structural way of dealing with those. So we said, okay, we're going to split into incident team and problem team. So at that time, about 10 people, and we said we're going to have 3 people on the problem team, 7 people on the incident team, and we would rotate. So everyone had to do all the jobs, which is another DevOps principle in my experience, right? So we had people who'd been developers, been tech leads, were now in support. So they knew how the software was built, and they knew how it was run as well. We significantly improved our reporting. So we moved to Jira, and we got much better metrics on time to solve, all those sort of things. And we actually wrote down each stage of the investigation process and what we were doing. So we got very good at recording information. One of the big reasons was, again, when senior people wanted to see how an incident had been handled, they would actually ask for the incident. They wouldn't talk to us. They would just say, what's the ticket number? And they would look at the incident report and go back to the customer and say, I can see this has been done, this has been done, this has been done. Because those people themselves were ex-engineers. So our ops director was a former developer. And so all these things really improved the flow of the system. It was much easier to operate this team because people were now, if they hadn't recorded their steps, they would be in trouble, because that was very firmly the process we had to follow. So we'd improved in those 6 years in process ways quite well. By 2014, which is when this was taken, 13th of September 2014, this was when I was heavily, as you can tell, heavily into Docker. But by that time, we were quite advanced. We had 50 engineers in multiple locations on support, and we had dozens We then had dozens of clients with basically hundreds of applications. Originally, there were 3 main applications our product had, and that grew to being 20 or so main applications. And then each customer had his own bespoke applications for things that they'd asked for themselves. We had 1,000 P1 incidents a year to deal with, and it didn't really matter if it was our problem to solve or not, if it was our software. If someone cut through a cable, which once happened, cut through a power cable and brought down one of the biggest bookies in the country, we had to help them with those. And yeah, so we're in a slightly better place by this point. Okay, so is this SRE or not? So there were, at the time, by 2014, we were calling ourselves DevOps, which wasn't really true because we weren't building it and running it, although we could build it as well as running it. I have my own theory about DevOps versus SRE. To me, DevOps was the kind of thing that happened by default. Like I say, you have a company, you have a team building software, and then they're selling the software, and then, we've got to run it. If you have microservices architecture, like a pure microservices architecture where each team is responsible for its own data store, then it makes sense, or its own product purely, then it makes sense for that team to be doing DevOps. But Google then came up with the SRE concept. Google's a huge company. Not every team can be responsible for its own software. It runs on a huge platform. That platform needs to be centrally run. So it's something more like Google, but we weren't in charge of the customer operations, although we had our own operation to support all those different customers. So it's a little bit of a murky picture. But we had a lot of the things that you might expect of an SRE team. So we had to keep metrics of everything we did. We had to be able to look at performance issues. Performance issues were the biggest issues we faced, because if people couldn't place bets, there was no business. Didn't matter if the site was up. If it took 20 seconds to place a bet, that was effectively the site down. We had direct edit access to all code bases. We had access to all live databases. We also could fix stuff in production without checking it in, which was unusual even for then. But we would just patch stuff on live and then retroactively change the code down the line because each minute mattered. We also, because we were senior engineers and tech leads, we would advise dev teams on patterns that worked and didn't work. So some of our development teams had very smart people who'd never done any kind of operations. And those people were told, listen to those guys because they know how things break. So that was fun. Okay, so at this time, what were the challenges? So when there were 7 of us making 7 million a year, it was great. We had a very good profit margin. We had pretty happy clients and things were good. But we got more customers. The profit margin was decreasing. The number of applications we had to support were massively increasing. The drift between different customers' code bases was getting higher and higher. There were more and more specific things with particular products and particular clients. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, the problem of growth. But the thing is, we'd never really restructured. We'd never really done anything to change anything. We'd done ITIL, which had helped, but all we'd done is really add more people to it. And so management started asking questions. Do you really need tech leads and seniors? And we were like, yes, this is an elite job. We need the best. And they were like, nah, no, you don't. You need to save money. The question would come up, can you take grads? And no, we can't have grads. We need experience, 2 years experience minimum, and the most promising engineers. And we had people saying, why don't you just re-architect your 15-year-old software stack across your many customer bases? Not really an option. Why don't you just fix all your technical debt and fix all the long-standing problems? Not enough time in the day. And even if we had fixed a lot of those things, then rolling them out would be a challenge because customers were much more interested in the next new feature than fixing problems. This was the situation I found myself in, and here's what we did. Okay, so has anyone read either of these 2 books? I recommend all people in SRE read these 2 books. Absolutely, 100% recommend. So The Goal is a fantastic book. It's the book on which the Phoenix Project was based. I think in the Phoenix Project, the other place that they talk about is the factory in The Goal. The Goal was written in the late 80s. It's got very little about software in there, but it's absolutely applicable to software things. And basically that book talks about the theory of constraints. Any problem in your system if you're trying to make a system more efficient, like a factory, then you have to look first at the biggest bottleneck. Ignore everything else. Just focus on the next bottleneck and the next biggest bottleneck and so on. And then eventually things will flow smoothly. There's a lot there. The other one, Checklist Manifesto, is a fantastic book. It's about various industries and how they manage complexity. And it, for example, looks at aviation. Boeing in the 30s, there was a saying that the Boeing was too much plane to fly. Increasingly, you had to have more and more expert pilots. And eventually they built a plane that basically was crashing all the time. And they had to think again. So what they did was they implemented checklists and trained pilots in common failure modes. And so someone recommended this to me while I was working this job, and I read it and I was like, a light bulb went off and I was like, I know what I have to do. It also talks about medicine and how checklists help in medicine, another obviously very practical area, and also about the nature of effective checklists as opposed to complete checklists. So it's very much about getting the best practical outcome, not getting the perfect information. Anyway, thoroughly recommend these two books. If you take one thing from this, get those two books. The first thing I did was I went through every single priority incident from the previous 2 years and collated them, categorized them and collated them. This picture, which I'll blow up in a minute, this is me tracking myself going through these, because it was such a long process that every percent that I did, I wanted to do it. Also, the number says there 68 out of 1,186 or something. The number on the right was going up as I was writing it. So there were several incidents coming in at each point. And at the end, I think it's something like 1,930. Oh no, up here, 2,128 by the time I finished. So it doubled. The number doubled by the time I'd caught up. And I needed this because I was on call. So I needed these incident models, we called them, or runbooks or checklists or whatever you want to call them. I needed them to work because I was on call and I was getting phoned up about stuff and I couldn't remember how to do things. So yeah, I was the first customer of this process. And when we have clients today who come to me and say, oh, tell us how to, we had someone ask us to write 50 runbooks for them recently. And I said, there's no point me writing you a runbook. Only you should be writing your runbook and then using them. And I will coach you on using them and running and making them part of your process. But the content is just, no, that's you. The consumers should be in charge of the documentation. And that's one of the things that I learned. So yeah, that's the whole picture. Started on the left there and ran out of space and had to go up here. That was the whiteboard behind me as I was doing it. Each thing is like 1 or 2% over the 7 months. Yeah, you can see there's 55%, 56%. I'm trying to catch up desperately. We also so I did that. That was one side of it. And we also made a few other big changes. So process improvements we made were, we introduced a triage process. So we had one person in our team was responsible, or 1 or 2 people actually in our team, so we were 50 by then, were responsible for the triage process, which was itself a checklist. So ticket comes in, first thing you do is, this a big deal? If it is a big deal, shout. Next, find previous incidents which look similar, so on. People went mad doing that role, so we switched it every week. So you were on triage for 1 week, then you moved back to engineering or support engineering. We also implemented a post-incident review. So every incident would have a post-incident review, which again was another checklist. And that checklist would be followed, but usually got out of it quickly because it was clear what needed to be done. But every incident, it was checked whether the runbooks worked against them or not. These processes took up a certain percentage of our work. So triage was about 10%. Post-incident review was about 7 or 8%. These were the investments we made in order to make the cost per ticket reduce. The other thing we did in post-incident review was make business cases for problem fixing. Because we had all this data about linked tickets, we could then say, this costs us X amount in time. And if we spend 3 days implementing automation around this, then it's worth it. But usually it was 3 week projects if we wanted to fix something. Okay, what we learned. I made it all sound very easy, very logical, but at the time it was not clear how it was going to work or whether it was going to work. Particularly the writing. I was managing this team. Alarms were going off all the time. Customers were phoning up. I was having to write priority one incidents, reports for clients. And there I was just tapping away, looking like I was not doing much work. It took 4 months of writing those incident models, those runbooks, before other people started taking notice. And it wasn't because I told them to, it was because they would say, oh, is that issue's come in again that we have. And I would say, look at the runbook. And they didn't want to, really. It just wasn't part of their habits. That was a big challenge. People don't like writing, people really don't like writing, I learned, especially when they think other people are going to read it. It's different if you're doing an incident log. Doesn't really matter, but it does matter, but you might not think it matters. But as soon as you're writing something for other people, they panic. So I found that was a big difficulty, getting other people to do it. We made our checklists too complicated. So we had our checklist had too many steps, too much of a structure around them, our runbooks, and we had to cut them down. And we also had people saying you should use the expensive documentation system we bought. We were like, no, we're using Jira, we live in Jira, we work in Jira, we're just going to put plain text into Jira, and that's going to be our method of reading. Huge benefits came from this, particularly on the onboarding, stress level, cognitive load. Passing things back to the engineering teams became a lot easier because the process by which we determined that something was a problem was documented. So before we go back to a tech lead and say, hey, your team should take this on as a problem to fix, and they'd be like, no, your guys just aren't good enough. But once we had this sort of process, they could contribute to that process, that runbook, and they could help with that. Cost per engineer went down quite significantly, and automation became easier because we had done the first stage of automation, which is obviously to write down the steps. And then it was quite relatively easy to write that into code if it was worth the effort. Lessons learned from this whole process. We started too complicated. When you're dealing with people, you've got to keep things as simple as possible, even removing things that you might think are important. Just cut back to make it easier for them to use the process, to consume the process. It's very important to have personal commitment to a good product, if you like, the product being the process that we were running. If we didn't have that, then that would be, and I learned later that people moved from our team and the habits were not kept. And one of the big things I learned was people love to complain about docs, but no one likes to write them. And if you just get on with it and write it, then eventually people will follow. But you've got to be committed to that project. Okay. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Comments? Yes.
Have you used any of the modern tooling that kind of streamlines some of this today? We're using Fire Hydrant for a lot of our incident management process, and it forces you into that thing you learned the hard way, and people are still learning the hard way. Have you experienced any of those?
No, I've never heard of Fire Hydrant. We had bit of an aversion to tooling, and I still do. I still use Vi. I use Visual Code if I'm using particular languages, but the Fire Hydrant I've not heard of. I'm curious. What? Yeah, there's lots of Runbook, Jupyter Ops type things. I haven't used them. They might be great. I don't know. But I found that a lot of people would suggest tooling, and actually a lot of the work we did was very much more thinking than tooling. The tooling can obviously help you. But for example, the documentation, we had this fantastic documentation tool which had an ID for every doc and all these fields to fill out. And we were like, no one's going to stop their work, move from Jira, which they're constantly on, and then go to this other thing and do that. They're just not going to do it. As long as it's seamless with the way you want to work, as long as it's supporting that, fantastic, use the tooling. Yeah, I've been interested how that world has grown since 2016.